New York City in 1863 was a place of contradictions. It was the largest city in the United States, a hub of commerce, culture, and immigration. Its streets were crowded with ships unloading goods from across the world, and its neighborhoods were filled with people from Ireland, Germany, and many other lands. Yet beneath this energy lay deep divisions. The Civil War was raging, and the city was torn between loyalty to the Union and resentment toward the federal government. The war had already lasted 2 years. Thousands of men from New York had gone south to fight, and thousands more had died. Families mourned sons and fathers. The city's economy was strained. Prices rose, jobs were scarce, and poverty spread across working-class neighborhoods. For many, survival was a daily struggle. The wealthy, however, continued to live in comfort, their mansions standing in stark contrast to the crowded tenements of the poor. The draft law passed in March 1863 was the spark that would ignite the city. For the first time, the federal government required men to serve in the army if called. But there was a catch. Anyone could pay $300 to hire a substitute and avoid service. For the rich, this was manageable. For the poor, it was impossible. To many working-class men, especially Irish immigrants, the law felt unfair. They saw it as a system that forced them to fight and die, while the wealthy bought their way out. Tension grew in the weeks before the draft began. Newspapers carried angry editorials. Political leaders argued. Rumors spread through taverns and street corners. Many Irish workers feared that if they went to war, freed slaves from the South would come north and take their jobs. This fear was stoked by politicians who opposed the war and newspapers that played on racial prejudice. The city was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. On July 11, 1863, the first names were drawn in the draft. The lottery was held at the 9th District Provost Marshal's office on 3rd Avenue. The process was orderly, but resentment simmered. Men cursed under their breath as names were read. Families worried about losing their breadwinners. The anger was quiet, but real. 2 days later, it would explode. July 13th began as a hot summer morning. Crowds gathered near the draft office. At first, they shouted and jeered. Then stones were thrown, windows shattered. The crowd surged forward, overwhelming the small police presence. The draft office was set on fire. The flames rose into the sky, signaling the start of what would become the deadliest civil disturbance in American history. The riot spread quickly. Telegraph wires carried news across the city, but the authorities were slow to respond. Police tried to hold back the crowds, but they were outnumbered. Firefighters arrived to put out the blaze, but rioters cut their hoses. The mob grew larger, fueled by anger and fear. Soon, the violence was not just about the draft. They had become an eruption of racial hatred and class resentment. City leaders struggled to respond. Mayor George Opdyke called for calm, but his words carried little weight. Governor Horatio Seymour, a critic of the war, tried to reassure the rioters by promising to address their grievances. But the violence was beyond speeches. The city needed soldiers. Union troops, fresh from the Battle of Gettysburg, were rushed to New York. Their arrival would eventually bring order, but not before the city was scarred forever. The first day of the riots revealed the depth of anger in New York. It showed how fragile the city was, how quickly order could collapse. It was a warning of what was to come. The days ahead would bring more destruction, more death, and more questions about the meaning of justice and equality in America. The story of the draft riots is not just about fire and blood. It is about the people who lived through them, the workers who felt betrayed, the families who lost loved ones, the children who saw their homes destroyed. It is about a city struggling to define itself in the midst of war. And it is about the choices that leaders made, choices that shaped the future of New York and the nation. As the smoke rose over 3rd Avenue on that July morning, few could imagine how far the violence would spread. The city was entering a dark chapter, one that would test its strength and reveal its deepest divisions. The riots had begun, and New York would never be the same. The morning of July 13, 1863, had begun with smoke on 3rd Avenue, but by the afternoon, the flames had spread far beyond one draft office. New York City was unraveling. The riot was no longer a single protest, it was becoming a citywide upheaval. Crowds surged through the streets, growing larger as workers left their jobs and joined in. The draft office was only the first target. Soon, police stations, armories, and businesses were attacked. Rioters smashed windows, looted shops, and set buildings ablaze. The city's fire department struggled to respond, but rioters cut hoses and blocked engines. Fires burned unchecked, lighting up the skyline. The violence was not random. It carried a message: anger at the draft, resentment towards the wealthy, and hatred towards African Americans. The mob saw black residents as symbols of the war they despised. They believed the war was being fought to free enslaved people who would then come north and compete for jobs. This fear, mixed with prejudice, turned into brutal attacks. African American men were dragged from streetcars and beaten. Some were lynched in broad daylight. Homes of black families were destroyed. The Colored Orphan Asylum, a refuge for more than 200 children, was set on fire. The children escaped, but the building was reduced to ashes. The cruelty shocked observers, yet the mob pressed on. Police officers fought bravely but were overwhelmed. They carried clubs and pistols, but the crowds numbered in the thousands. Officers were beaten, some killed. The city's mayor, George Opdyke, tried to calm the violence, but his words had little effect. Governor Horatio Seymour arrived and addressed the rioters, calling them friends and promising to look into their grievances. His attempt at peace was seen by many as weakness. By evening, the city was in chaos. Telegraph lines carried news of the violence to Washington. President Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet were alarmed. The Union had just won a major victory at Gettysburg, but now its largest city was burning. Troops were needed, yet most were still in Pennsylvania. Orders were given to send regiments to New York as quickly as possible. The second day, July 14th, was worse. Rioters grew bolder. They attacked wealthy homes, looted jewelry stores, and burned businesses. They targeted symbols of authority, including police stations and government buildings. The mob seemed unstoppable. Yet amid the destruction, there were moments of courage. Some police officers stood their ground against overwhelming odds. Firefighters risked their lives to save buildings. Ordinary citizens sheltered their neighbors, hiding African American families from the mob. Churches opened their doors to protect the vulnerable. These acts of humanity stood in stark contrast to the cruelty on the streets. The violence spread uptown and downtown. Crowds roamed Broadway, the Bowery, and the waterfront. Ships were threatened, warehouses looted. The city's economy ground to a halt. Merchants shuttered their shops, fearing attack. Banks closed. The stock exchange suspended trading. New York, the financial heart of the Union, was paralyzed. By July 15th, Union troops began arriving. Fresh from Gettysburg, regiments marched through the streets. Their presence brought hope, but also more bloodshed. Soldiers fired volleys into crowds, killing rioters. Cannons were positioned at key intersections. The army was determined to restore order, no matter the cost. The troops clashed with rioters near Gramercy Park and other neighborhoods. The army's discipline and firepower began to break the mobs. Slowly, the violence ebbed, but the scars remained. The riots revealed the deep divisions in New York. They showed how class resentment, racial prejudice, and political conflict could explode into violence. They exposed the fragility of order in a city of millions, and they left behind a trail of destruction, burned buildings, shattered lives, and hundreds dead or wounded. The official death toll was reported as around 120, but historians believe the true number was much higher, possibly over 400. Thousands were injured. Property damage was immense, estimated at millions of dollars. The city would take years to recover. Yet the riots were more than statistics. They were a human tragedy. Families lost fathers and sons. Children were orphaned. Communities were torn apart. The African American population of New York, once growing, declined sharply as many fled the city in fear. The riots reshaped the city's demographics and deepened racial divisions. The draft riots were not just a local event, they were part of the larger story of the Civil War. They showed the challenges of fighting a war that demanded sacrifice from all citizens. They highlighted the tensions between rich and poor, native-born and immigrant, white and black. They forced leaders to confront the question of equality and justice in a nation at war. As the fires died down and soldiers patrolled the streets, New York faced a new reality. The city had been shaken to its core. The riots were a warning of what could happen when fear and anger went unchecked. They were a reminder that the struggle for freedom and equality was not only fought on battlefields, but also in the streets of America's greatest city. The days of July 1863 left a mark that would never fade. The draft riots were over, but their legacy was just beginning. New York was a city of immigrants. By 1863, more than a quarter of its population was Irish. Many had fled famine in their homeland, arriving poor and desperate. They worked as laborers, dockhands, and servants. Their wages were low, their living conditions harsh. They crowded into tenements where disease and poverty were constant companions. Yet they clung to hope that America would offer them a better life. But life in New York was not easy. The Irish faced discrimination from native-born Americans. They were mocked in newspapers, portrayed as drunkards and criminals. They were excluded from many trades. They competed with African Americans for the lowest-paying jobs. This competition bred resentment. Many Irish workers feared that freed slaves from the South would come north and take what little work they had. Politicians and newspapers fed this fear, turning it into hostility. The draft law added fuel to this resentment. To the Irish, it seemed designed to protect the rich and punish the poor. Politics made the situation worse. New York was a stronghold of the Democratic Party, which opposed many of President Lincoln's policies. Governor Horatio Seymour was a Democrat who criticized the war. He believed the draft was unconstitutional. His speeches gave hope to those who resisted conscription. Newspapers aligned with the Democrats, such as the New York Journal of Commerce and The World, published articles attacking the draft and stirring anger among workers. At the same time, Republican leaders in the city supported the war and the draft. Mayor George Opdyke, a Republican, tried to enforce the law. But his authority was weak. The city's political divisions mirrored its social divisions. The riots were not only a clash between citizens and the government, they were a clash between two visions of America. Race was at the center of this clash. The Civil War was fought to preserve the Union, but it was also increasingly about ending slavery. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued in January 1863, declared freedom for enslaved people in the Confederacy. For African Americans, it was a step toward justice. For many Irish workers, it was a threat. They feared emancipation would bring more black laborers to New York, competing for scarce jobs. This fear turned into violence during the riots. African Americans were singled out for attack. Men were beaten and killed. Women were assaulted. Families were driven from their homes. The colored orphan asylum was burned, leaving children homeless. The brutality shocked the nation. It revealed the depth of racial hatred in New York. Yet not all New Yorkers shared this hatred. Some stood against the mob. White citizens sheltered black families in their homes. Churches opened their doors to protect the vulnerable. Police officers risked their lives to defend African Americans. These acts of courage showed that compassion still existed amid the violence. The riots also exposed the fragility of order in a city of millions. New York was the financial capital of the Union, yet it was vulnerable to collapse. Banks closed, businesses shuttered, and trade halted. The city's economy was paralyzed. Merchants feared ruin. The stock exchange suspended operations. For a few days, the nation's largest city was at the mercy of the mob. The arrival of Union troops began to restore order, but the damage was done. The riots left hundreds dead and thousands injured. Property losses were immense. The African American community was devastated. Many fled the city, reducing its black population for years to come. The riots deepened racial divisions and left scars that would not heal quickly. The draft riots were more than a local disturbance. They were a reflection of the nation's struggle. They showed how the Civil War was not only fought on battlefields, but also in the hearts of cities. They revealed the tensions between rich and poor, immigrant and native-born, white and black. They forced leaders to confront the meaning of equality and justice in a nation at war. The riots also raised questions about democracy. Could a government demand sacrifice from its citizens without offering fairness? Could a city survive when its people were divided by race and class? Could the Union endure when its largest city turned against it? These questions haunted New York long after the fires were extinguished. The draft riots showed the cost of war, not only in blood, but in trust. They revealed the dangers of inequality and prejudice. They reminded the nation that freedom was not only about ending slavery, but also about building justice for all. As soldiers marched through the streets and the city slowly returned to order, New Yorkers faced a sobering reality. The riots had shaken their city to its core. They had exposed its deepest divisions, and they had left behind a legacy that would shape its future. On the morning of July 13, Patrick O'Connell, an Irish laborer, left his tenement on the Lower East Side. He had heard rumors of trouble at the draft office. He was tired of scraping by, tired of watching wealthy men escape service while men like him were forced to fight. He joined the crowd, shouting with others. At first, it felt like protest, but as the mob grew, the protest turned into violence. Patrick found himself swept along, not entirely in control. He saw windows smashed, flames rising, and men beaten. He did not strike anyone, but he did not walk away. He was part of the crowd, part of the storm. Across the city, Sarah Williams, a black seamstress, was at work when the riots began. She lived in a small apartment near the Bowery. When word spread that mobs were attacking African Americans, she rushed home. Neighbors warned her to stay inside. She heard shouts in the street, then pounding on doors. She hid with her children, praying the mob would pass. That night, she saw the glow of fires and smelled smoke. She knew the colored orphan asylum had been destroyed. Fear gripped her heart. She wondered if her family would survive the week. Police officers faced their own battles. Captain John Kennedy, superintendent of police, tried to confront the rioters on the first day. He was beaten nearly to death. His men fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. Some officers stood alone against crowds of hundreds. They swung their clubs until they fell. Their courage was remarkable, but their losses were heavy. Firefighters also suffered. They rushed to burning buildings only to be attacked. Rioters cut hoses, smashed engines, and beat men who tried to save lives. Fires spread unchecked, consuming homes and businesses. The city's fire department was powerless against the fury of the mob. Soldiers arriving from Gettysburg faced a different challenge. They had just fought one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Now they marched into their own city, ordered to fire on fellow citizens. For many, it was a painful duty. They saw women and children in the crowds. They knew some rioters were desperate workers, not hardened criminals. Yet they had to restore order. Cannons were placed at intersections, muskets fired into mobs. The army's discipline broke the riot, but at a terrible cost. There were also stories of compassion. Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, a prominent preacher, urged his congregation to shelter African Americans. Churches opened their doors, offering refuge. Some white families hid black neighbors in their homes, risking attack themselves. These acts of humanity shone amid the darkness. Children witnessed the chaos. They saw fires consuming buildings, mobs chasing men through the streets, soldiers marching with bayonets fixed. For many, it was their first glimpse of violence. The memories would stay with them for life. Merchants counted their losses. Shops were looted, warehouses burned. The city's economy ground to a halt. Banks closed, fearing attack. The stock exchange suspended trading. New York, the financial capital of the Union, was paralyzed. For businessmen, the riots were a nightmare. For workers, they were a desperate cry. The African American community bore the heaviest burden. Families fled the city, abandoning homes and businesses. The population of Black New Yorkers declined sharply after the riots. Many never returned. The violence left scars that lasted for generations. The riots also revealed the fragility of trust. Immigrants who had come seeking opportunity felt betrayed by the government. African Americans who had hoped for freedom faced hatred instead. Soldiers who had fought for the Union were forced to fire on their own neighbors. The city's unity was shattered. Yet, amid the destruction, there were lessons. The riots showed the dangers of inequality, the cost of prejudice, and the need for justice. They reminded leaders that laws must be fair, that communities must be protected, and that peace cannot be taken for granted. When the smoke cleared and the soldiers held the streets, New York was left with more than broken buildings. It was left with questions. Questions about leadership, justice, and the fragile bond between citizens and their government. The draft riots had shaken the city, but they also shook its politics. Governor Horatio Seymour stood at the center of this storm. A Democrat, he had long opposed the draft. He believed it was unconstitutional, that it gave too much power to the federal government. When he addressed the rioters as friends, he hoped to calm them, but his words were remembered as sympathy for violence. Critics accused him of weakness. Supporters praised him for trying to prevent further bloodshed. His reputation was forever tied to those days. Mayor George Opdyke faced his own trial. A Republican, he supported the draft and Lincoln's policies. During the riots, he called for order and tried to rally the police. But his authority was limited. The mobs ignored him. His mansion was threatened. His leadership seemed fragile. For many, the riots revealed how little control the city's government truly had. President Abraham Lincoln watched from Washington. He had just celebrated victory at Gettysburg, but now his largest city was in flames. He ordered troops to New York, determined to restore order. For Lincoln, the riots were proof of the war's deep divisions. They showed that the struggle was not only against the Confederacy, but also within the Union itself. Newspapers played a powerful role in shaping public opinion. Democratic papers blamed the draft and Lincoln's policies. They argued that the riots were the result of government injustice. Republican papers condemned the violence, pointing to racial hatred and lawlessness. The press turned the riots into a battlefield of words, each side using the tragedy to advance its cause. The riots also influenced national politics. They gave strength to critics of the war, who argued that Lincoln's policies were tearing the country apart. They fueled debates about conscription, race, and equality. They forced leaders to confront the reality that the Union was not united. In the weeks after the riots, the city struggled to rebuild. Businesses reopened, families returned to their homes, and soldiers remained on guard. But the political scars lingered. The draft continued, though with greater caution. The government tried to ease tensions by reducing quotas and offering more exemptions, yet resentment remained. The African American community faced the harshest aftermath. Many fled the city, reducing its black population for years. Those who stayed lived in fear. They had seen their neighbors turn against them, their homes destroyed, their children threatened. The riots deepened racial divisions and left wounds that would not heal quickly. For immigrants, the riots were both a cry of anger and a mark of shame. Many Irish workers felt betrayed by the government, forced to fight a war they did not believe in. Yet their participation in the violence stained their reputation. They were seen as rioters, as enemies of order. The riots reinforced stereotypes that had long plagued them. The political reckoning extended beyond New York. Across the nation, leaders debated the meaning of the riots. Were they proof of injustice in the draft law, or were they evidence of dangerous prejudice and lawlessness? The answers depended on politics. Democrats pointed to government failure, Republicans pointed to mob violence. The truth was more complex. The riots were born of both injustice and hatred, both poverty and prejudice. The draft riots forced the nation to confront hard truths. They showed that war demanded sacrifice, but sacrifice must be fair. They revealed the dangers of inequality, the cost of prejudice, and the fragility of democracy. They reminded leaders that laws must serve all citizens, not only the wealthy. In the months that followed, New York slowly returned to normal, but the memory of July 1863 lingered. It haunted politicians, shaped debates, and influenced elections. It reminded the city of its divisions and its fragility. It stood as a warning of what could happen when anger and fear went unchecked. The riots were not only a tragedy, they were a turning point. They forced leaders to reckon with the realities of war and the demands of justice. They showed that the struggle for freedom was not only on battlefields, but also in the streets of America's greatest city. As soldiers marched away and businesses reopened, New Yorkers faced a sobering truth. Their city had been tested, and it had revealed its deepest wounds. The draft riots were over, but their political legacy was only beginning. Before the riots, New York had a growing black population, with families building businesses, churches, and schools. The violence of July 1863 shattered that progress. Hundreds of African Americans were killed or injured. Many fled the city, abandoning homes and livelihoods. The population of black New Yorkers declined sharply in the years that followed. Fear lingered. Families who stayed lived under constant threat. The riots deepened racial divisions and left wounds that lasted for generations. The Irish immigrant community also bore consequences. Many Irish workers had joined the riots out of anger at the draft and fear of losing jobs, but their participation stained their reputation. Newspapers across the country condemned the violence, portraying Irish immigrants as lawless and dangerous. This reinforced stereotypes that had long plagued them. Yet, within the Irish community, the riots were remembered differently, as a desperate cry against injustice, a moment when the poor resisted a system that demanded their lives while sparing the wealthy. The riots also reshaped politics. Governor Horatio Seymour's response was criticized by Republicans, who saw him as weak. His attempt to calm the rioters by calling them friends haunted his career. Mayor George Opdyke's inability to control the city weakened his standing. President Lincoln, watching from Washington, saw the riots as proof of the Union's fragility. They reminded him that the war was not only against the Confederacy, but also against division within the North. Economically, the riots were a blow to New York. Businesses were destroyed, warehouses burned, and trade halted. The city's role as the financial capital of the Union was shaken. Merchants feared ruin. Banks closed. The stock exchange suspended trading. Though the city recovered, the riots revealed how vulnerable its economy was to unrest. The riots also influenced the draft itself. The government continued conscription, but with greater caution. Quotas were reduced, exemptions expanded, and enforcement softened. Leaders recognized that forcing the poor to fight while the wealthy escaped was a recipe for disaster. The riots forced changes in policy, though they did not end inequality. Nationally, the riots were a warning. They showed that the Union was not united. They revealed the dangers of inequality, prejudice, and political division. They reminded leaders that democracy was fragile, that laws must be fair, and that peace could not be taken for granted. The riots also left cultural marks. Writers, journalists, and historians recorded the events, shaping how they were remembered. Some emphasized the cruelty of the mobs, the attacks on African Americans, and the destruction of the orphan asylum. Others focused on the injustice of the draft, portraying the riots as a rebellion of the poor against the rich. The truth was complex. The riots were both a protest against unfair laws and an eruption of racial hatred. For ordinary New Yorkers, the memory of July 1863 lingered. Families remembered the fires, the mobs, the soldiers marching through the streets. Children who witnessed the violence carried those memories into adulthood. Communities rebuilt, but trust was broken. The riots left a shadow over the city, a reminder of how quickly order could collapse. The draft riots were not only about New York. They were part of the larger story of the Civil War. They showed that the struggle for freedom was not only on battlefields, but also in the streets of America's greatest city. They revealed the cost of war, not only in blood, but in trust. They forced the nation to confront the meaning of equality and justice. As the years passed, New York grew again. Immigrants continued to arrive. Businesses flourished. The city remained the financial capital of the Union. But the memory of July 1863 never disappeared. It was a warning, a lesson, a shadow. It reminded New Yorkers of their divisions, their fragility, and their need for justice. The riots had shaken the city to its core. Their long shadows stretched across decades, shaping race relations, politics, and the identity of New York itself. They were not only a tragedy, but a turning point, a moment when the city confronted its deepest wounds.